and you have it in the chat for your reference. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our second roundtable of the spring 2021 semester. I'm Kaylin, the Panoramas coordinator for this academic school year. For those who don't know, Panoramas is an online student-led publication dedicated to the news, research, culture, and art of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latinx and Caribbean diasporas. This semester, we're going to be hosting a roundtable discussion every week, and I'll send you the link for next week's discussion after Abby presents. Please like us and follow us on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date. And I'll post that stuff too. Oh, and then Abby's article, which I encourage you to read if you have not already, is also in what I just dropped in the chat. Today, Abby will be speaking about the double-edged sword of sustainability in Latin America. While Abby is presenting and during the discussion, please feel free to use the chat feature for any comments or reactions, like use the reaction features too. And then also during the discussion, please use the raise hand feature that you'll find under the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now to Abby.
Thanks, Kaylin. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today for today's second roundtable discussion. So today I'll be talking about lithium mining in South America and how, while it may be supporting a more sustainable technology, there are some drawbacks to the process of its extraction that make it less sustainable, which will have to be addressed going forward. So I think that the natural first question to ask is, why do we even care about lithium? So as the name implies, lithium is an important component of lithium-ion batteries. These batteries have a lot of different applications, but they have been receiving a lot of attention recently because they're used to power electric cars. These cars are seen as a more sustainable alternative to fossil fuel powered cars. And thus, given the climate crisis that we're in, they've been receiving a lot of attention lately and are increasing in popularity. In fact, the International Energy Agency estimates that the number of electric cars on the road worldwide will increase from 3 million in 2017 to 125 million in 2030. This is an over 40-fold difference over the span of just 13 years. This boom in demand is being driven by both public and private action. In the public sector, both France and the United Kingdom, for example, have committed to fully transitioning to electric cars in the coming years. Similarly, in the private sector, General Motors recently announced that they will be producing only electric cars by 2025. So we're seeing the trend move in this direction, and we can only assume with this trajectory that we'll be moving more in that direction, especially as more consumers become more environmentally minded. So where do we get this lithium? So there are two different ways that lithium is deposited on Earth. The first is in rocks, which is found in places like Australia, and the other is in salt flats. The lithium is more abundant. There are more abundant sources of lithium in the salt flats, and in fact, 70% of the world's lithium deposits are found here in the Lithium Triangle, which contains parts of Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. So this will be our area of focus today. So what I've said about lithium mining so far makes it sound like there's a lot of potential for good. And this is to some extent true. Lithium extraction is the backbone behind a powerful alternative to gas-powered cars, and this shouldn't be understated. Motor vehicles are a big contributor to greenhouse gases, and given the urgency of the climate crisis, this is a huge positive. Additionally, lithium mining has a lot of economic potential for these countries, assuming that it's done in a non-exploitative way. The abundance of this resource could invite foreign investment, foster a new industry, create jobs, diversify the economy, all that good stuff. Additionally, there is already a high demand for this resource that will likely only increase over time, which could make it a bit more stable of an economic project than some other resource extractions sometimes are. However, there are some downfalls to lithium mining that need to be addressed before going forward. The first is that of water. Lithium is extracted from salt flats by pumping a bunch of water underneath the surface of the salt flat and then waiting for it to evaporate, leaving behind the lithium. This process, as you can imagine, is incredibly water intensive. Currently, with the technology available, 1 ton of lithium mined requires about 500,000 gallons of water to be extracted. The anticipated demand for lithium by 2030 is about 240,000 tons per year. Multiplying the 240,000 tons per year by the 500,000 gallons per ton, that works out to about 120 billion gallons of water per year. This, mind you, is all happening in a relatively dry place. A lot of this area is desert, so there's not a ton of fresh water there to begin with. This is a problem that has been acknowledged, and people in the industry are working to improve technologies so that it's not as water intensive and also use ocean water instead of fresh water. But nonetheless, I find that this math is helpful to underscore the urgency of solving this water crisis, especially given since we've already seen an impact. An independent hydrologist named Marcelo Sticco, for example, says that he believes that the region will soon become uninhabitable because of how much water is being used in the lithium mining process. Beyond water, other environmental effects of lithium mining have not been extensively studied and thus are unclear. One such example is whether or not during this evaporation, lithium and other chemicals are carried by the wind, potentially harming crops and water supplies. Additionally, as I'll discuss in more depth in a moment when I talk about Bolivia, the Lithium Triangle includes many beautiful natural landscapes that could be damaged as a result of mining. These landscapes have intrinsic value for their natural beauty and also are significant sources of tourism revenue for many of the towns in the area. Mining threatens to destroy these livelihoods. Lastly, mining has potential to harm local populations, the majority of which are indigenous and already marginalized. Their communities have been disrupted, often without compensation, and also in many cases have not been informed of the impact that mining could potentially have on their communities. Thus, this process needs to be improved not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective. So having gone over the big picture of lithium mining in the region, I want to turn now to look at the state of affairs in each of these 3 countries that constitute the Lithium Triangle. Each country has different political and economic traditions, as well as different ethnic compositions, which means that they have faced different challenges and are in different places with dealing with these issues. So I'll start off by talking about Chile. Chile is considered to be one of, if not the most capitalistic countries in Latin America. As a general rule, they are more open to private investment and letting the market sort of do its thing, and this is reflected in their lithium policies. They've tried to attract private investment, particularly foreign investment, and this has worked pretty well. However, this openness has perhaps gone a bit too far, as some evidence suggests that they're allowing private companies to unduly influence regulations and the enforcement thereof. A Chilean company, for example, Soquimich, for example, was accused of skirting past regulations and giving illegal financial contributions to political candidates to try to get a more favorable regulatory environment. Much of the mining that happens in Chile takes place in the Atacama Desert, pictured here, and the Atacama Indigenous Council has been very vocal about not wanting more mines in the area. They even were successful in blocking a recent project that was supposed to be carried out by a Canadian company. However, even with this success, Indigenous people are still a marginalized group in Chile. They are not protected or even included in the current constitution. And so it's unclear whether or not the success was just a one-time thing or if the Chilean government will actually be listening more to the Indigenous peoples on this issue going forward. Argentina, on the other hand, has a bit more of a mixed history as far as its politics and economics are concerned. I want to talk about first Mauricio Macri, who is pictured here on the left, who was president during much of the initial boom of electric cars up until recently. To develop the industry, Macri slashed taxes to try to make Argentina a more favorable environment for foreign investment, not just for lithium, but for other resources. This worked, but it wasn't without consequence. Several indigenous communities, the Salinas Grandes, Guayatayoc, and Coya indigenous communities, all filed lawsuits in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the Macri government, charging that they were basically completely excluded from the process of beginning the lithium mining in the area and were not informed of the potential consequences that extraction could have. At the end of 2019, Alberto Fernandez, who is pictured on the right, was elected president of Argentina. He's much more to the left of Macri, and what his presidency will bring for lithium is sort of a mixed bag. On one hand, he has said that he wants to develop the lithium industry, but on the other hand, he's a bit more open to regulation. So what the remainder of his presidency will bring for lithium remains to be seen. Finally, Bolivia is a bit different than in Argentina and Chile for a couple of reasons. The first is that Bolivia's indigenous population is significantly larger than the small minorities that are present in Argentina and Chile. Bolivia's first indigenous president, Evo Morales, who governed for 14 years, aspired for a state-owned, domestically developed lithium industry that would not only extract the lithium, but also produce the lithium-ion batteries. This has become sort of a national project and a source of pride for many Bolivians. However, there are a couple of potential complications that arise in creating a lithium industry in Bolivia. The first is that Bolivian salt has a significantly higher concentration of magnesium than salt in other places, which makes it so that it requires more resources to extract and also creates more waste in the process. The second is that Bolivia is home to the Salar de Uyuni, pictured here, which is a spectacular salt flat landscape that is not just a top tourist destination in Bolivia, but also of all of South America. Mining has already begun on the Salar, and some worry that going too far with this could potentially permanently damage the landscape. On top of this being tragic in and of itself, it would also be detrimental to the economy of the town of Uyuni, which is almost entirely based in tourism. I won't get into the details of the political crisis that unfolded in Bolivia over the past year or so, as that's an entirely different topic. But in summary, after a brief period of time in which a different party was ruling, Evo's handpicked successor, Luis Arce, is now president of the country, likely signaling a return to this idea of a nationalized lithium industry. So lithium is a dynamic topic that is evolving in real time. And I think it's important that we have this conversation now about its sustainability rather than years down the road. So before we begin with our discussion, I want to close with a concept that I think is a helpful framework to look at lithium mining as well as lithium policy, and that is sustainable development. The International Institute for Sustainable Development defines development as, quote, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In other words, finding clean energy solutions and finding alternatives to gas-powered vehicles, as well as lowering our emissions, are all problems for now. However, these problems are urgent and necessary for the survival of our planet, for the survival of for humans, and however, we need to address these problems in a way that doesn't cause other social and environmental problems that can come back to haunt us later on. If we're not doing that, we're not actually finding solutions. We're really just kicking the can down the road. So with that, I'd like to open up for discussion. Here are a couple of discussion questions just to get your thoughts going. But if you have any thoughts or questions or comments that you'd like to share, and using the raise hand function or put them in the chat.
Abby, we have a question in the chat from Stephanie.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having technical issues.
Fine.
I can hear you.
What parts of the world dominates this predicted trend of increase of electric cars, and where in Latin America will the increase occur the most?
So is that question meaning in terms of like where the cars are being used and like where they're like where people are planning on driving them, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah.
It was just based on the first slide, just to give you a hint on where I got that question from.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's predominantly happening in places like the United States and Western Europe that are able to, create electric cars, and also they're currently pretty expensive. So it's even a luxury still for many people in those Western countries that have a lot of money on hand. I assume, though, that as the technology improves and the cost of creating electric cars becomes greater, it will become more affordable, not just for people in the United States and Europe, but also for people around the world. And hopefully, eventually, they'll become the new norm if we're able to do that in a sustainable way. So, yeah, I think that right now, at least, though, the demand is being focused on, like how France and the United Kingdom, for example, on the first slide you saw, are the countries that are aspiring to do this. So it is definitely a more a problem or like a trend that's being fueled there and hasn't necessarily reached other parts of the world quite as much yet.
Looks like we have a question from Ashley.
Okay,
Hi.
sorry.
You're good.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just Zoom is being difficult for me right now, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I was just gonna say, let's see. I have a few questions for you. So I know that primarily we've seen a lot of your writing being geared around indigenous populations. So in terms of like resistance and throughout your research, did you find any trends of how like the government in Latin America handles or acknowledges like lawsuits filed by indigenous communities? I know you mentioned in your paper that a lawsuit was filed regarding the lithium mining, but I was wondering if you saw like a trend of how they acknowledge this, or do they grant precedence over, non-POC organizations?
Yeah, it does seem, in the research that I found both with this and with the previous roundtable last semester, it does seem that they tend to, like a lot of times it seems like the interests of the indigenous communities often comes into conflict with resource extraction and with these sort of like more economically oriented problems that are always backed by like big companies. And unfortunately, the governments have a tendency of siding with the companies, generally speaking. So, but I have seen, it seems like a lot of time, but like conversely with that, oftentimes these like protests and these acts of resistance are a bit more successful when they kind of like hit them where it hurts, which is the more economic side of things. So, for example, back when talking about the indigenous people in Brazil last semester, they were successful. The protests where they were blocking the road was successful because they were basically like holding the economy hostage. And a similar thing happened in Chile recently in trying to block lithium. They also were doing like a road protest. So I think that kind of like putting pressure in that way has been successful for them. But yeah, unfortunately, the court cases do have a tendency of being sided with the bigger like multinational corporations and not so much with the indigenous people when they try to file lawsuits.
Taylor, raise your hand. I don't know if you can see Abby.
Yeah, no, sorry. I'm trying to stop the sharing like you suggested to see if that helps at all. Yeah, I can hear you, so you can go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Great presentation. Super interesting topic. I guess my question is, and this might be on the scope of your research, but what role in terms of like foreign investment and kind of economic intervention. Like I'm mainly thinking of China, but I mean, even other countries, whether corporate or even countries intervening in the region for this extraction.
Yeah, so definitely like a big driver, especially in Argentina and Chile, has been that these like companies and foreign companies are investing in these, like in the region and using and like going in and starting mining operations there. So I think that that's actually like one of the biggest drivers of that. I don't know specifically what countries have been the most active in that. I did see a couple of American companies as well as Canadian countries come up in, or not Canadian companies, sorry, come up in my research. But yeah, I would assume that China is also doing a lot in that regard, given that just like that's a general trend that they've been trying to get more economically involved in Latin America. And obviously they produce a lot of different electronics in China. So I assume that they're looking for a good lithium source to be able to like make their batteries there and use the batteries to basically have like the entire production process for electronics be taken care of by the government.
Great, thank you.
And then Ben has his hand up as well.
Yeah. So I know that Bolivia is a majority indigenous country and that Evo Morales is an I forget exactly what group he's from, but I know that he was indigenous Bolivian, and I know that that is in contrast to Chile and Argentina. So I was wondering if Bolivia under Evo was more sympathetic to the wishes of indigenous peoples when it came to lithium mining.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that question is, if I'm being completely honest with you. Because we do still see, I would assume that the same problems that are present with as far as like the water and things like that are concerned that are present in Chile and Argentina have also been present in Bolivia. So I don't know if that aspect of it necessarily made them like changed the level of sympathy toward those problems. Like what I was saying about the town of Uyuni, for example, they're still facing this potential loss of a lot of tourism revenue as a result of the lithium mining on the Salar de Uyuni. So I think that there's still, like even with the indigenous president, they still did face a lot of these problems. But I don't know exactly how exactly he or his government handled like this more like social aspect of that. But that's a good question.
Really good question. Luke, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so excuse me. This is more of a rhetorical question and food for thought than something I want you, Abby, to necessarily answer, because I'm not even sure we as a population have an answer. But I mean, we've noticed from history that with every technology and resource comes a new environmental problem. Often multiple new environmental problems. It's been seen with dams, factories, mining, petroleum, whale oil, guano. So my question is, well, I have multiple questions, but one of them is, how prepared is the world to take on a new resource? I mean, as you mentioned, the hunt for lithium can prove to be detrimental to the already damaged environment, right? So I feel like it could potentially act parallel to the petroleum industry, which has already significantly impacted the world despite its relatively young age when compared to that of human civilization. So my final questions, by the time the petroleum industry takes more than it can give, and by the time the lithium industry has passed its peak, will governments finally have created adequate technology to survive on natural resources with a net zero impact on our planet? Or will we as humans never learn from our mistakes and, once again be faced with dwindling resources and a crippled planet?
Yeah, no, I mean, like that's a super good point. that it's kind of just like this never-ending cycle of we now, like you said, we've already seen that there's a lot of negative impact from petroleum. So now we're turning now to these like electric cars to avoid using gas. But in the process, we're creating a new problem. And then it's the question of what's going to replace this. So it is like sort of a brutal cycle. I will say that I think if I may be an optimist for a moment, that it's good though that, I mean, not good, but that we're kind of at least sort of learning our lesson from petroleum, and that the fact that we're even having this conversation and asking the question of like, can we continue doing this? Is it sustainable? Instead of just like waiting and finding out 20 years down the road that it's not sustainable and that it's caused a lot of damage. I think the fact that we're talking about this and asking the question of like, is what we're doing currently sustainable, is kind of a good sign for the future, though it doesn't really solve that endless conundrum that you brought up.
If I could respond to that, because this is really relevant for me as an environmental science major. This is like, that's like the dreaded thought that everyone is like, don't bring it up in class, you know, or like we're learning all these trade-offs for all these new technologies, you know, there's only so much that it solves. And then like there's like lithium, for example, that was actually going to be my next question for you, Abby, was just like, you know, what other technologies are there? Because we see that lithium is really great for this push for electric, and electric is nice if we can use like renewable energy like solar, you know, and wind. But then we have this problem of like the actual mechanics of it, the metal, the mining issues, how that affects indigenous communities and how they don't have a say in those industries, and the encroachment on their traditional lands or stuff like that. You know, there's just so many elements. And yeah, Luke, I think that's a really great question to keep bringing up. And I think that like, especially for governments who are trying to make these decisions and implement these policies, it's this never-ending question of like, by that time that it starts becoming extremely detrimental for our lives. You know, like right now we're still living we're starting to get climate refugees, you know, we're starting to head into that very like apocalyptic stage of like these terrible changes that we're afflicting onto our environment. But like, I think there's a lot of optimism from people in charge that like technologies are going to be invented and we can like suck carbon out of the air and stuff. And it's such a complex issue. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's like the existential question of like, so like as an environmentalist, always like thinking about that and dreading it, but then trying to be optimistic and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your insight as an environmental studies major. That's really great. But I know you brought up like within that, with what you were saying, talking about like alternatives for lithium, and it's really just a difficult thing, because I did look into a couple of alternatives that are being thrown around, and all of them sort of every single one of them has drawbacks. For example, there's zinc batteries are being thrown around as an option because they are more easily recycled. Lithium is a pretty volatile metal, and zinc isn't volatile, so that's another benefit to that. But zinc reserves are also set to run out at the rate that we're mining for zinc right now. Another option is sodium sulfur batteries are another option, but and these resources are a bit more abundant, but there's also the issue of volatility, and also that they require higher reaction temperatures, which requires like a ton of energy to produce and maintain. Another one is the hydrogen battery that also has the issue of volatility, and it also is energy intensive and expensive, but at the same time, like hydrogen's all around us. So that makes it a little like, and it's in the air. So we don't have to worry about, having to extract it from the earth. So there are a number of different alternatives that are being developed, but all of them sort of have their own drawbacks that make it difficult to have it be like the next big thing. But yeah, that's really good. Thank you for your insight.
And then Ashley has a question. I'm not sure if you can see yet, Abby.
Yeah, I'm still having difficulty with that. Thank you for your help, Caitlin.
Yes, I'm back. So, going off of both what Luke and Stephanie said, I kind of had like a more personal question for you, which is that do you personally feel that these efforts are like futile, or are they for the better? And with that, I mean, like, will technological advancement ever be sustainable, or should we look towards practices that have always been here, like indigenous practices, or what is your thought on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because on one hand, we have seen technological advances that have made our lives a lot easier. And I kind of question it's difficult to even imagine for like the world that we're living in, what even like a world without technological innovation would look like. And the pessimist in me wonders if we're kind of like too far gone down that road, that we're too connected as like a globe, and that we're going to have to continue kind of down this road of technological innovation. But yeah, I don't know. It's a really difficult question to answer. I think that the more that we the more that we can look to those practices that have always existed and see like what we can do to return to those things could definitely be a good thing for everybody to do. But yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, we do kind of take it for granted, the concept of technological innovation, but it's good food for thought to think, like, do we have to think that, like, do we have to accept that we should always be moving forward with technology, or should we turn back to kind of what's always worked? So that's a really good, I don't know if I have a definitive answer to that question, but it's definitely like a good thing to think about and consider what our framework even is for having these conversations.
You know, Abby, I was thinking while you were presenting about just like the vast amount of inequalities that come with sustainability, and on our, our quest to fix the problems that we as humans have created on this planet, and just like how we are potentially causing even more. I'm wondering if you found any other sustainability practices like lithium mining for electric cars that in your research, again, this might be outside of the scope, that really highlighted the inequalities with this new sustainability movement and just like our reactions to climate change.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And this could just be me not being able to think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm not thinking. I'm sure that there are things that I've heard of before that definitely highlight that. But I, off the top of my head right now, in my research for doing this, I didn't uncover anything specifically. But that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, open question. I don't know if anyone else had any.
Yeah, if anybody else has any examples, that would be great. But
what did you in your research think about the last question, which you have on your slides, which you can't see, is where's the best area to focus research and resources with regard to innovation? And some examples you put were improving mining practices, improving battery recyclability, and new types of batteries. This kind of follows up on a question someone asked already, but like, what do you think would be the best area to put resources towards?
Yeah, so I think that improving battery recyclability is probably like the best area for us to be focusing on, because that sort of eliminates this problem of constantly having to extract new resources, whether it's lithium or zinc or anything else, that if we mine enough of that to be able to create enough batteries that we have like enough in circulation, as long as we're able to recycle that, then we wouldn't have to continue to mine and extract and take more resources. So I think that focusing more on recyclability and making sure that we're able to get as much recycle as much of the material as possible, that we're making it easier to recycle, and basically just like designing the batteries with recyclability in mind would all sort of lower the need for us to rely on just constantly mining. Right now, I think only about 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled, even though they are recyclable, just because there's a lot of cost prohibition, as well as people not entirely being sure what to do with it. And the batteries are so compact that they are difficult to take apart. So I think that focusing more in that direction, there's a lot of room for improvement that could potentially eliminate the need for this entire difficult problem that we're addressing with the issue of mining.
My initial question, Luke, which you posted in the chat, was about other inequalities related to sustainability practices slash what we're doing to fix climate change, and if it was creating any other potential inequalities, like how lithium mining is creating some inequalities. I don't know if that made sense. Probably said it better the first time. Are there any other questions from the audience, any other comments or existential questions? Isabel.
Yeah, so my question is a little like more political, and I don't really expect you to like know the answer because it is kind of hard. But in a country like Australia, which is like the world's top producer of lithium, and I don't know if this came up in your research, but I'm assuming that they've like tried to address the issue of making lithium mining more sustainable in some way. But do you think how these countries may be like addressing this issue could work similarly in South America? Or is it like more complex, taking into account factors like weak regulations and political traditions?
Yeah, so there's the big difference between Australia and South America. There definitely is the issue of what the regulation environment looks like, but the biggest difference between lithium mining there and in South America is that it's a different kind of mining that's happening. So I mentioned when I was talking about like initially introducing the Lithium Triangle, that there are two different ways that lithium is deposited on Earth. The first is in rocks and the second is in salt flats. So in Australia, most of the mining that's happening is being done through the rocks, which means that they don't have to worry about the issue of, at least about the issue of water and this sort of like destruction in that regard. But I tried looking into some of the regulatory practices that Australia has, and it doesn't seem like they have a lot of big federal oversight. But yeah, I think that the main difference between those two isn't so much they don't have, I guess what I'm trying to say is that Australia doesn't necessarily have the same sort of sustainability questions that South America has to deal with. So it's kind of difficult to apply what Australia is doing to what's happening in South America. But that's a really good question.
Thank you.
I would imagine also it would be a matter of the companies investing in this kind of mining might have different regulations and like labor laws that they have to be held accountable to. I don't know if I sent you that podcast I was talking about, Abby, when we were talking about this article that you were writing, but they mentioned that in relation to just where these minerals are coming from.
Yeah, no, that's another thing is with the companies is that it turns into this sort of brutal cycle that, with what you're talking about with like the weaker political and economic traditions, Isabel, that these companies come into places like Chile and Argentina, for example, that have intentionally made their like regulatory laws so that these foreign companies will come. So they have more lax environmental regulations. They have these lower taxes, and they have just like generally less regulation on these companies. And oftentimes, as we saw in that example with Sokimich, they let the companies sort of dictate what the regulations even look like. And then they become more economically dependent on having these companies come in and like extract the lithiums. It's like a really good resource for them. So then it becomes harder to break that cycle and sort of like increase the regulations without sacrificing this economic benefit that they're getting from it.
Totally. A comment from Stephanie in the chat for Abby is the most frustrating part for me about these kinds of discussions about solving sources of unsustainability is that the prevention versus repair, as in we know that prevention and mitigation are the best solutions, yet require the most fundamental change and initial cost. And so many current policies and green solutions are about solving environmental problems after the fact. And that's I totally agree with that, Stephanie. It's like, and just like our obsession with like greenwashing things now too, from like a marketing standpoint, right? Like, oh, go ahead and drive your car and take your planes, but use, a little bit less plastic when you wash your hands. It's just like a little, I guess, besides the point.
Yeah.
Rant for that.
Yeah, and then the thing is that it shifts the responsibility away from the companies that are actually responsible for creating a lot of the emissions and a lot of the waste, and it pushes the responsibility onto the individual consumer. I mean, and you can apply that also to the idea to electric cars, in that we're pushing consumers to go and buy these like fancy new electric cars because they're more sustainable, supposedly, and they're more eco-friendly, so people want to buy them. But at the same time, these companies are going into places like Chile and Bolivia and Argentina, and wreaking havoc on their indigenous communities and taking all their fresh water in the process of mining for these electric cars. So it kind of takes the responsibility away from the companies that are actually doing most of the damage, and puts it on the consumer, so that the consumer personally feels like they're responsible for solving this problem.
Totally. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Any last thoughts or comments or questions? Wow, Abby, your screen will not stop sharing.
Oh my gosh.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Abby, for a wonderful presentation. Despite your technical difficulties, you killed it. I am going to drop the link in the chat for next week's roundtable, and I encourage you to register. Where Peyton and Bridget are going to be talking about mental health and disability resources in Chile. It'll be really great. It'll be their first roundtable. So we hope to see you there. And thank you everyone again for coming. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Abby.